Claude responded. They say a man who has never been quietly humiliated in his own family has never really been tested at all. They say a man who has never been quietly humiliated in his own family has never really been tested at all. I have been tested more times than I can count, and every single time I let it happen, not because I couldn't stop it, because I wanted to see exactly how far people would go when they thought there was nothing behind my eyes but a tired old man with nowhere else to be. My name is Walter Grady. I am 67 years old. I drive a 2004 Ford Explorer with 214,000 miles on it, a long crack in the windshield shaped like a river fork, and a passenger door that you have to slam twice to get it to latch. My daughter, Nora, has offered to buy me a new one more times than I can count on both hands. I always tell her the same thing. This one still knows where it's going. I live alone now. In the same house on Cutter's Mill Road I bought back when the street was still gravel and the Hendersons next door still had that old dog that used to bark at the mail truck like it owed him money. My wife, Elaine, passed 6 years ago. Cancer, quiet, the way she did everything. I still make coffee for 2 most mornings out of habit before I remember. Here is what my neighbors don't know. Here is what the fellas at the hardware store don't know. The ones who nod at me like I'm just another retired guy killing time in the lumber aisle. Here is what the woman at the bank, bless her, still doesn't know, even after cashing my checks for 11 years. I own Halbrook Industries. Manufacturing, commercial real estate, a logistics arm that moves freight through 6 states, and a private holding company that owns pieces of businesses. Most people drive past every single day without knowing my name sits quietly behind the deed. Halbrook Industries is worth just north of $2 billion. I built it from a single sheet metal shop my own father started in 1961 with a bank loan and a prayer. I have never once put my name on a building. I have never given an interview. There is no plaque anywhere with my picture on it. I decided a long time ago that a man's worth and a man's wealth are 2 very different measurements, and I was never going to let the second one do the talking for the first. Now, let me tell you about my daughter, because she is the reason any of this matters at all. Nora Grady Ellison is 32 years old, and she is sharper than I ever was at her age, funnier than her mother, and kinder than both of us combined, which tells you something about the kind of woman Elaine and I managed to raise together. When Nora was 8, she talked me into letting her keep a stray cat by presenting me with a handwritten contract outlining her responsibilities, complete with a signature line for me to initial. I still have that contract in a drawer somewhere. I signed it because I couldn't argue with the logic, and honestly, because I was proud of her for trying. What I did not see coming, what no father ever really sees coming, was the man she would marry. 4 years ago, Nora brought home Marcus Doyle. I want to be fair here, because I try to be fair to everyone, even the people who make it difficult. So let me describe Marcus as generously as the truth allows. Marcus Doyle is the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately starts calculating where he ranks in it. He's 36, tall, the sort of handsome that comes from a gym membership he mentions unprompted. He wears watches that cost more than my first car, and he has a habit, and I do mean a habit, of steering every single conversation back towards something he owns, something he closed, or somewhere impressive he just got back from. Within 20 minutes of meeting me for the first time, he told me about his Ivy League MBA, his handicap on the golf course, and a business trip to Zurich. Zurich. He said it the way certain men say the names of European cities when they want you to understand they've been somewhere you haven't. I nodded and told him that sounded wonderful. 8 months after he and Nora started dating, Marcus was named president of Faro Manufacturing. Now here is where I need you to stay with me, because this is the part that matters. Faro Manufacturing is a subsidiary of Halbrook Industries. 360 employees, a strong reputation, contracts with 2 of the largest hardware distributors on the East Coast. A real company, built on real work. Marcus got that job through what looked, on the surface, like a completely normal hiring process. An executive search firm, 4 rounds of interviews, background checks, a formal board vote, clean as a whistle from where he was standing. What Marcus did not know, and does not know to this day, is that I sat quietly on every single stage of that process, from the very first resume to the final signature. I reviewed the shortlist personally. I read every reference call transcript. I approved his salary. I signed the paperwork that made it official. Then I drove home in the Explorer, changed into my work clothes, and spent the afternoon replacing a fence post that had rotted through. Marcus called Nora that night, and Nora called me right after, so excited I could hear her smiling through the phone. Dad, he got it. President of the whole company. Good for him, I said. Tell him I'm proud. Then I hung up and went back to watching the ball game. I want to be honest about something. In the beginning, I genuinely wanted to like Marcus Doyle. I have hired hundreds of people in my life, and I've learned that first impressions are just a man's opening pitch, not the whole game. People surprise you sometimes. Marcus never surprised me. He confirmed things, slowly, the way water finds every crack in a foundation eventually. It started small. Then came the company holiday party, his company, he believed, where he introduced me to a room full of his executives, and one of them, a younger man with a very confident haircut, asked me what I did for a living. Before I could get a word out, Marcus jumped in. Oh, that's Nora's dad. He's retired. Used to do something with, I don't know, small business stuff. He laughed a little when he said it, like it was a joke we were both in on. I smiled. I shook the man's hand. I said something pleasant about the shrimp cocktail and let it go, but I filed it away, the way I file most things away. The moment that actually changed something happened on a Wednesday afternoon about 5 months back. I had stopped by Pharaoh's offices to sign off on something through one of my holding company people, quiet as always, nobody looking twice at an older man in a flannel shirt carrying a folder. I was passing the break room when I heard Marcus's voice through the half-open door. He was talking to someone, another manager. From the sound of it, I stopped walking. Nora's dad? Marcus was saying, and I could hear that easy laugh in his voice. Oh, he's harmless. Sweet old guy, kind of a nobody, honestly. Fixes his own gutters. Drives some ancient SUV that should have been scrapped a decade ago. Nora feels obligated to check on him, which, I mean, family's family, right? But there's not much there. I stood in that hallway for a moment. Then I straightened my collar and walked out the way I came, unremarkable as ever. Sweet old guy, kind of a nobody. I let those words sit in me for 5 months. I come from patient people. My father used to tell me that a slow leak sinks a boat just as surely as a fast one. It just gives you more time to watch it happen. So I watched. If this kind of story is speaking to you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button before we go any further. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you know. Thank you, truly. The dinner invitation came on a Sunday evening while I was out watering the tomatoes. Nora called, bright and warm the way she always sounds when something makes her happy. Marcus's parents, Richard and Carol Doyle, wanted to host a family dinner out at their place in Ashcombe Hills. Richard had spent 30 years running a regional bank before retiring. Carol had never worked a day in her life and had built her entire personality around the square footage of her kitchen island. Dad, you're gonna love them, Nora said. They're a little much, but their hearts are in the right place. I'm sure they are, sweetheart, I said. I already knew a few things about Richard and Carol Doyle that would have made that sentence a lot harder for Nora to get out, but I kept it to myself. I told her I'd be there with bells on. Then Marcus called me directly, which surprised me enough to be interesting on its own. He was casual, friendly, the specific kind of friendly that precedes something a little insulting. Hey, just a heads up about Saturday, he said. My parents, they're pretty traditional, old-school folks, so maybe think about, I don't know, dressing it up a little. Nothing crazy, just something a step above the usual. There was a pause where he was clearly waiting for me to be grateful. Marcus, I said, keeping my voice easy, I appreciate you thinking of me. Of course, he said, relieved. Just want you comfortable. You know how my folks can be. I do now, I said. See you Saturday. I hung up and stood in my hallway for a while, looking at myself in the mirror by the coat rack. Then I walked to my closet, past the good suits in the back, the ones I wore when Halbrook bought out its biggest competitor 9 years ago, past all of it, and I pulled out my plainest clothes. Clean, pressed, Unremarkable. I laid them out on the bed for Saturday. Then I walked out to the driveway, rested my hand on the hood of the old Explorer for a second, the way you'd rest a hand on the shoulder of someone who's earned your trust. "We're going to a dinner, old girl," I said out loud, feeling a little foolish and not caring. Dress code's humble. We've got that handled. Because here's what Marcus Doyle didn't understand. Here's what Richard and Carol Doyle had no idea about. I wasn't dressing down because it was all I had. I was dressing down because I wanted to see exactly who these people were when they believed nothing was at stake. And something in my gut, 40 years of gut, told me they were about to show me everything. Saturday came in quiet, the way most important days do, no fanfare, no warning. I woke at 5:30 like I have most mornings of my adult life, made coffee, black, the way my father took it, sat at my kitchen table, and watched the light come up slow over the maple tree. Elaine planted, the year Nora was born. I dressed plain, clean khakis, a simple button-down, the collar a little soft from age. My work shoes, polished, but nothing that would turn a head. I looked at myself in the mirror and thought, that's exactly right. I drove out to Ashcombe Hills, the Explorer groaning a little on the hills like it always does, and pulled up a driveway lined with hedges trimmed so precisely they seemed to be daring you to notice. A young man in a blazer stood near the entrance, somewhere between a valet and a greeter, and his job was clearly to make you feel welcomed or sized up depending on what you were driving. He looked at my Explorer, then at me, then back at the Explorer, with the face of a man doing some quick, unflattering math. "Evening, sir," he said, recovering fast. "I can park that for you." "Thank you, son," I said, handing him the keys. "Pulls a little right. Don't let it worry you." He nodded like a man trying not to have further opinions about the vehicle in his hands. Richard Doyle opened the door before I could knock. Tall, silver-haired, the kind of build that had probably intimidated boardrooms for decades. His smile was warm in the way a store display is warm, arranged carefully to look inviting. "Walter," he said, shaking my hand a beat too briefly. "So glad you could join us. Come on in." The house said exactly what it was built to say. High ceilings, art selected for its price tag rather than any feeling it stirred, a staircase that curved up like it knew people were watching it. Carol appeared from the sitting room, elegant in that specific, assembled way, jewelry understated in the way that only very expensive jewelry manages to be. She took both my hands in hers. "Walter, we've heard so much. You are just as sweet as Nora described." Sweet. There it was. Not sharp, not accomplished, not a man who might surprise you. Sweet. The word for old dogs and elderly uncles who've stopped following the conversation. "Thank you, Carol," I said warmly. "Beautiful home you have." She glowed. People who've built their whole identity around their possessions never get tired of hearing about them. Nora crossed the room and hugged me the way she has, since she could barely walk, and I held on a second longer than I needed to. "You look good, Dad." "So do you, sweetheart." Marcus appeared behind her, looked at my clothes with a flicker he tried to swallow before it reached his face. Then the recovery smile clicked into place. "Walter, glad you made it," he said, clapping my shoulder for an audience. "Come see what Dad's opened up." Something special. That turned out to be the theme of the whole evening. The wine, the food, the house, all of it something special. Except me. We sat down to dinner at a table set with the kind of formality that takes hours and exists specifically to remind certain guests of the distance between themselves and their hosts. I unfolded my napkin, looked around at the people who'd invited me into their home, and made myself invisible. Not because they made me that way, because I chose it. A man who corrects people's assumptions too early has already lost the advantage of being underestimated. So I sat, smiled, asked polite questions, complimented wine I hadn't tasted yet, and I watched. Richard led the table the way men like Richard always do, from the front, loud, absolutely certain nobody had ever once told him he talked too much. Markets, a recent trip to Portugal, and Marcus's remarkable instincts running faro. "The boys turned that place around," Richard said, swirling his glass. "Board loves him. Leadership runs in families, I've always believed." He glanced my way when he said it, just briefly, just enough to draw a line without saying it out loud. I nodded appreciatively. "That's wonderful. You must be proud." Then Carol turned to Nora with a smile that had a very particular shape to it. And Nora, it must feel so good having a husband who provides like this. Not every girl gets that kind of security. The table went quiet for a fraction of a second too long. Nora smiled graciously, but I saw her eyes. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and said nothing at all, because I knew, the way you know weather is coming, that when the real moment arrived, everything at that table was going to change, and I only needed to wait a little longer. The moment came with the coffee. I had been at that table 2 hours, nodding, smiling, complimenting wine, laughing at Richard's stories that weren't quite as good as Richard believed. I'd played the part flawlessly, the sweet, harmless father-in-law, the fellow with the beat-up SUV who fixed his own gutters and didn't have much going on. I wore that role easy as an old coat, and not one soul at that table suspected there was anything underneath it. Then Richard reached down beside his chair, and I felt that shift I've learned to recognize, the one that means the waiting is finally over. He set a leather folder on the table, smoothed it flat with his palm, and slid it across to me. "Walter," Richard said, voice dropping into a rehearsed register, "there's something we wanted to bring up as a family." I looked at the folder. Didn't touch it yet. Carol's hands folded on the table in front of her. Marcus sat up a little straighter, working hard at looking casual. Nora glanced at me, uncertain, then back at her father-in-law. Her hands weren't still. "Marcus has an opportunity," Richard continued. "Wants to branch out on his own, start something independent. A real chance, the kind that comes around once. We believe in him completely." "As you should," I said. "What we need," Richard said, nodding at the folder, "is some startup capital. And what we're proposing is simple. Nora's trust, used as collateral to secure the loan. Perfectly legal, drawn up properly, all above board." He leaned forward. "We just need your blessing, Walter." As her father. He looked at Nora, then at Carol, whose smile hadn't moved an inch, then at Marcus, calm and certain, already spending money he'd decided was as good as his. And I thought, you have no idea whose table you think you're sitting at. I opened the folder, read every page slow and deliberate while the candles burned down and the clock on the wall ticked through a silence nobody dared break. Then I closed it, set it down gently, picked up my water glass, and looked at Richard with the warmest smile I had in me. "I appreciate the thought that went into this," I said. "I'll review it carefully." Richard let out a breath like he'd been holding it the whole meal. Marcus's shoulders dropped half an inch. Carol reached for her wine like the hard part was behind her. They thought they'd won. I made pleasant conversation another 20 minutes, thanked Carol for a lovely evening, shook Richard's hand a second time, firm, held his eyes just one beat longer than he expected. He had no idea what that second meant. Out in the driveway, the young man brought the Explorer around with the face of someone who'd spent the whole night quietly judging that vehicle and had finally made peace with it. I tipped him more than he was expecting and watched his expression shift. I drove home through the dark, and I was calmer than a man in my position had any right to be, which probably would have unsettled anyone who knew what was coming. I said nothing for 12 days. Not a word. Not a flicker. I mowed my lawn, had coffee with my neighbor Hal on his porch, went to church, drove the Explorer to the hardware store, and back like any other week. On day 3, Marcus texted, "Hey Walter, just checking in. Did you get a chance to look over the paperwork? Pretty exciting stuff." I waited 2 hours, then wrote back, "Still reviewing, son. These things take time." He sent back a thumbs up. I set the phone down and made a call, not to Marcus, not to Richard, but to 2 people who'd sat on Pharaoh's board for over a decade, men who understood that when I called personally, it wasn't a social visit. "Start the audit," I said. "Full scope, standard cycle. Today." Then I went back out to the tomatoes, because here is what Marcus Doyle did not know. What Richard and Carol Doyle, sitting in their house in Ashcombe Hills congratulating themselves over good wine, had no idea about. I had personally drafted every line of Marcus's employment contract, including a fiduciary duty and non-compete clause buried on page 11 that he'd signed 4 years ago without reading closely enough. A clause I had written into every executive contract at Halbrook 18 years before Marcus Doyle ever walked into my daughter's life. Written for exactly this kind of man. I'd waited 18 years. I could wait 12 more days. What the audit turned up took 9 days to fully lay out, and when the report landed on my desk, I sat with it a long while. Not from shock. I wasn't shocked. I sat with it because I wanted to be certain, completely certain, before I moved. Marcus had spent 7 months quietly building his own venture, on company time, using company equipment, leveraging Pharaoh's supplier contacts and client list to construct something that would compete directly against Halbrook Industries, confident the whole time that nobody above him was paying attention. He had forgotten something I consider close to a law of nature. You cannot build a secret inside a house you don't realize belongs to the man you're hiding it from. Every meeting, every file, every call made on company time, all of it a direct breach of the clause he'd signed, all of it documented, and sitting in a folder on my desk. The Thursday morning, I put on the good Navy suit from the back of my closet and drove the Explorer to Faro Manufacturing. I parked in the reserved spot out front, the one with the small sign that read Halbrook Industries, the spot Marcus had walked past 3 times a week for 4 years without ever once asking whose name was on it. I walked into the boardroom, sat at the head of the table with 2 board members to my left and legal counsel to my right, the audit findings squared in front of me, and waited for Marcus Doyle to walk through that door, believing he was showing up for a routine check-in. The door opened. He came in, wearing his usual confidence, like a good coat, easy, natural, until his eyes found me sitting at the head of his table, in a suit he'd never once seen me wear. I watched the understanding move across his face in slow motion, floor by floor. The hiring process, the contract, the audit, Richard's proud toast, the folder sliding across the dinner table. 4 years landing on him all at once on a Thursday morning. The silence held a good 10 seconds. I let every one of them land. "Sit down, Marcus," I said quietly. He sat. "I'm going to say this once," I said, "not out of anger. I need you to understand that. Anger's for men who didn't see it coming. I saw this coming the day you told my daughter about your trip to Zurich." I opened the folder. "Faro Manufacturing belongs to Halbrook Industries. Halbrook Industries belongs to me. Has for 22 years. The company you run, the salary you've built your whole identity on, exists because I built it, brick by brick, before you were old enough to shave. I put you in that chair because I believed in what I saw. And for 7 months, you used everything I gave you to build something meant to compete against the very ground you were standing on." I closed the folder. "The clause in your contract covers every item this audit uncovered. Legal's prepared to take this all the way if we need to." Every ounce of the confidence he'd walked in with drained out of him. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, very young and very far from Zurich. "However," I said, "I've got no interest in ruining you. I'm interested in the truth getting settled. So here's how this goes. You resign today, quiet, professional. Your name stays clean, and none of this ever leaves this room. Or we go the other way, and everything in this folder becomes public record." He looked at the board members. Nothing there. He looked at the lawyers. Nothing there either. He looked back at me, and I saw something I hadn't expected, and I'll admit, it moved me a little. Not defiance, not a performance, shame. Real shame, the quiet kind that only shows up when a man finally sees himself clearly and doesn't care for the view. "I'll resign," he said, and the words looked like they cost him something. "Good," I said, standing, buttoning my jacket, gathering the folder. At the door, I stopped. "One more thing. That proposal your father brought to dinner, Nora's trust as collateral. I let that sit exactly 1 second. My attorneys moved her trust into her name this morning, fully, irrevocably, an account that requires her signature alone. Your father's proposal is now a document about money that doesn't exist where he thought it did. Tell your parents," I said, "thank you for dinner. The lamb was excellent." I drove home in the Explorer, the engine clearing its throat the way it always does on the first turn of the key, the crack in the windshield catching the last of the afternoon sun as I pulled onto Cutter's Mill Road. I sat in the driveway a minute, just sat there. 40 years of being the man nobody looked at twice, knowing exactly who I was the whole time. I patted the dashboard once. Good girl. Then I went inside and called my daughter. She came over 20 minutes later and found me at the kitchen table, 2 cups of coffee already poured. She sat across from me and studied my face the long, careful way she has since she was small, reading me like a map she's known her whole life. I told her everything, from the beginning. The company, the structure, the hiring process I'd run from behind a curtain, the contract clause written 18 years before Marcus ever showed up, the audit, the boardroom, moving her trust into her name that same morning. When I finished, Nora sat quiet for a long time. Then she looked up and asked the only question that mattered, the one I'd been carrying an answer for since the day she was born. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me? I looked down at my coffee, out at the dark yard, back at my daughter, at her mother's eyes looking out of her face, at the little girl who once talked me into a stray cat with a handwritten contract and won. Because I wanted you choosing your own life. I said, not one handed to you because of what I own. I never wanted you looking at me and seeing a company. I wanted you seeing your father, she cried, and I held her hand across that table and let her. I thought about Richard Doyle sitting very still in that big house in Ashcombe Hills, about Carol setting down her wine, about Marcus trying to find the words to explain to his parents how the quiet old man in the plain shirt had turned out to be the one person at that table they should never, not for one single second, have underestimated. I thought about all of it, and then I let it go, because the only thing that mattered in the whole world was sitting across from me right then, hands wrapped around a warm cup, eyes red, smiling anyway. My daughter, the best thing I ever built. Some men don't need to look powerful, they just are. And sooner or later, the ones who forget that always find out the hard way. Claude responded. Real worth was never in the watch, the suit, or the house on the hill. It lived quietly in patience, in a father's love that asked for nothing back, in choosy. Real worth was never in the watch, the suit, or the house on the hill. It lived quietly in patience, in a father's love that asked for nothing back, in choosing your daughter's happiness over the satisfaction of being seen. Sometimes the softest voice in the room carries the most strength. Stay humble, stay kind, and the people who truly matter will find their way to seeing you clearly. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its simple life lesson still warmed your heart a little.